We're starting Perek Dalet. Now, of course, I know what the Alter Rebbe is thinking. I don't, but I know how I was taught the Tanya when I was a child. How I was taught the Tanya as a bochel, and how I teach the Tanya. And the way we learn Tanya, in other words, we spent a lot of time on Perek Yud Beis, maybe 10 classes. Perek Gimel was quick. It was maybe 4 classes, or maximum 5 because we had an interruption with COVID. Perek Gimel went quickly. Why? Because Perek Yud Gimel is really a commentary on Yud Beis. Yud Dalet is a new Indian. It's not a hard Perek, but it's to understand. I mean, life, the easiest prakim of Tanya, the hardest prakim of Tanya. They're very easy to understand, but they talk. Some pupik, Perek Yud Dalet talks to us. Doesn't speak to Grace Bali Madrege, but it's not hard to understand, yeah? Perek Yud Beis is a Higoyen Dike Perek. It's in the Lashon of Rabbi Saul Jacobson. It says Vogik. That's what I hear. Vogik. It's loaded. It's a packed Perek. Perek Yud Gimel is a commentary on Yud Beis. How so? So again, this is how I taught it to you. And again, I taught it to you this way because this is how it was Moshe taught to me. That there's Madregas Habeini. Madregas Habeini is the same thing as Madregas Tzaddik and Madregas Rasha. On the first page of Tanya, on page 10, Daf Hey Omid Beis, the Alter Rebbe introduced us to the terms Shema Mushal and Shema Toyer. The borrowed use of words and the precise use of words. Amites Madregas Habeini. Amites Mahus Madregas Habeini. This is the words. There's a true definition of a Beini. Alter Rebbe says, a Beinani ain by afilu oven bittul teira umishum hochi toa rabba ba'atzmei. How could the rabbi make a mistake and say he's a Beinani? Because Beinani ain by afilu oven bittul teira. There's no avedis at all. So there's a concept called madregas habeini. So in Perek Yud we talk about madregas tzaddik. Perek Yud talk about madregas rasha. And in Perek Yud Beis madregas Beinani. And we gave it a label. We coined it. We framed it. This label I didn't hear from my teachers growing up because it comes from the Rebbe's Rishimis, which were in the Tparsim after I got married. The Rebbe sort of focuses in, at least this is my opinion, on the terms Melucho Memshala. And if you've been here for the last 6 months, you've heard it so many times, you can't wait for me to stop saying it. Madregas Habeini is an interface, it's a tziruf, it's a mix of a king and a dictator. When he davens, he's a king. When he works and plays and lives and so on, he's a dictator. What's the difference? A king is Malchusei Barotz, the nation accepts him willingly. And in this case, a king means that the Nefesh HaBahamis and the Guf accepts the will of the Neshama willingly because B'Shas HaTfilah, the Beinani is close to Madregas Tzaddik. Shalei B'Shas HaTfilah, but David Beinani is not davening, so then there's a real fight. He wins the fight. The Eibishter helps. The Eibishter sees to it that whatever the Leshiyah Meshefte Nafshe is, that he should win, because he's now only a dictator. His Nesahara and Guf are not cooperating. He fights with them, and he wins them every time. So Madregas Habeini is this balance between Melech and Moshe. So in Perek Yud Beis, we talked about this. In Perek Yud Gimel, we answered questions. Tanya started with a whole bunch of questions from Gemaras. And the Alter Rebbe answered 4 of the questions. Right? He asked the question about Zeh V'Zeh Shoiftan. He answered the question about Hayei Beinecha Kirosha. He answered the question about Eich Toa Rabba Ba'atzmei Leime Shehu Beinani. And then last week he also answered a question which I guess was not even asked, was how is the Avodas HaBeinani Emes, right? Sfas Emes. Tikin La'ad, V'adar Giyeh, Loshen Shoker. Hareini Kere, that in the Beinani's Tfilah, Sfas Emes Tikin La'ad. Right? Perek Yud Dalet is a new Beinani. And this new Beinani is not called Madregas HaBeinani, it's called Midas HaBeinani. What's the difference between Madregas HaBeinani and Midas HaBeinani? So I'm going to use Hebrew words. Madregas HaBeinani was Inyan from Mahus. Midas HaBeinani is Inyan from Metzias. In other words, Madregas HaBeinani describes a personality. Midas HaBeinani describes a behavior. I was talking about this Gimel Tammuz. This was sort of my Gimel Tammuz Fabrengen. I make a living making speeches. I didn't plan it. That's a geworden von dem Reden, that there's wer men is was men tut. Men darf sein Epis und men darf ton Epis. two very different things. There's who I am and what I do. You have to be somebody and you have to do something. Being somebody is very hard. It's called a madrege. Doing something we can all do. Madreges habenyani means to be somebody. Midas habenyani means to do something. It's a much lower level. Midas habenyani is not describing a personality. It's describing a behavioral condition, a inyan of machshava, diber, u'maiseh, which is measured poshet l'regoyim tebachadei, 1 second at a time. So let's begin to read inside. V'hine, Perik Yudalet, v'hine. Midas habenyani. Alter Rebbe is no longer talking about madregas habenyani, which is a mahus, which is a certain. It's describing the echos of a person, like I told you the Vort, if you remember, at the Rebbe Rashab said about the Bishol Neach. Zeitenweise said habenyani. Das ist doch Hazel Chaverte. The Rebbe Rashab said about Yisrael Chmelnitzki, Zeitenweise habenyani. I never met the Bishol Neach, but I heard about him. Zeitenweise habenyani, you're not tzaddik. The Rebbe, it's a different judgment. It's a different way a Rebbe measures. That's talking about madrege. But midas habenyani, so the Rebbe said midas habenyani, the measure of a benyani, where you're not describing what the person is in his substance. You're describing the behavioral life of this person in his actions. Says the Alter Rebbe, he midas kolal. This is a measure for everybody. And the mashmos dershim, the implication is, everybody is mechoyev to be a benyani. It's a pasuk in Chumash, karev elach adav miyed. But it's not easy. It's bechlal not easy. But midas habenyani is much closer to reality because it's a day-by-day thing. It's a minute-by-minute thing. It's an hour-by-hour thing. And this is what a person should pursue. A person has to ultimately reach madregas habenyani. But the beginning of avodas Hashem, the meshiach of a person, the direction which a person should be drawn. In other words, what a person should invest himself in, at least in tchilas ha'avodah. The meshiach should be midas habenyani. Shekol adam yochal. Rabbi explained. Every person is able lihiyes beinani, to be a beinani, b'chol esu b'chol shah, every moment and every hour. Period. We're no longer talking about a person that he never did an aveda, will never do an aveda. We're talking about eis v'shah, talking about now. What happened a minute before is gone. What's going to happen a minute from now is not available. What happens this minute, I can be a beinani this minute. B'chol eis, b'chol shah, every hour, every turn, a person could be a beinani. Okay? Ki ha-beinani, because the definition of beinani, einei me'es b'ra, is not somebody who's disgusted, who hates evil. Because hating evil is a madrega of a tzaddik. We discussed this at length many times in Perek Yud and in Perek Yud Beis. To hate evil is an emotional state, and it's really the madrega of a tzaddik. When it comes to madregas habenyani, even it's v'lei kol itim shavis. It's not all times; they're not the same. Sometimes you love Hashem and you hate evil. Other times you don't love evil, but it has nothing to do to behavioral life. A tzaddik oyavei Hashem sinura. A tzaddik always loves Hashem. A tzaddik always hates evil. And of course, the Alter Rebbe asserts very emphatically and repetitively at their base kam shkulim. If you love Hashem infinitely, you hate evil infinitely. If your hate for evil is not complete, so your love for Hashem is also not complete. In other words, a tzaddik sheini gomer, his hate for Ra is not total, his ava for tev is not total, and by a tzaddik gomer, it's not like that. A beinani can experience this ava to tev and sin to Ra when he davens in madregas beinani. Yeah. So the Alter Rebbe says that's not something which is sustainable always in the person's madregas beinani, and it's certainly not sustainable only when you're talking about the category that's called kol adam, all people. But midas habenyani, shebechol eisa bechol shah, that we have an ability now, this minute, to do what we must do. This is possible for each one of us. Ella, what defines midas habenyani? That he sur meira v'asei teif, that he stays away from evil and he does good. Tahainu b'peil mamish, on a practical level. That's it. We're not talking about kavanas. We're not talking about hergish. We're not talking about v'yidim. We're not talking about ruchnius. We're talking about b'peil mamish. You know that I read a booklet. Could you give it a kuntres about Harav Zela Katzman al Rashal? The Rebbe said about him to one of the mashpiyim in the yeshiva, when he was a bocher, wie steht jetzt, hat nicht kein Scheiches mit einer Aveda. That was the Rebbe's words. Wie steht jetzt, hat nicht kein Scheiches mit einer Aveda. It's peladik. Masber sein. It's not poshut. The Rebbe does. The Rebbe had nothing. What's the Rebbe supposed to say? What the Rebbe supposed to say? The Rebbe was an honest man. Yeah, he had something nice to say. He said it. He had nothing nice to say. He just kept his mouth closed. About a boy who came here from Russia on a taten, on a mama, on a Yossi. He was a bocher in 770, and the Rebbe said about him, "Wie steht jetzt," as he is right now. That's something which is close to the senior of Madregas Abenyani. The Rebbe didn't say all the bocher in 770. A lot of fine bocherim. Say fine bocherim. Because it's not the same. You understand? But midas habein, that a person should be a balabos, a master over self, on a practical behavioral level, in the minute, is absolutely possible. The Hainu B'Peil Mamish. I'm on page Yutesam Beis. Yes, I'm into Pedic Yud Beis. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 lines into the Pedic. Okay. B'Maise Dibur U'Machshala. On the action level, on the speech level, and on the thought level. Because Shabehem, when it comes to action, speech, and thought, Habechira V'Hayecheles V'Arishus. The free will, the possibility, and the freedom. The Rishus means permission. The Rishus means the freedom. The freedom. Nesuna l'chaladim was given to every person. This is more or less a Lashon Rambam. The Rambam has 2 chapters on free will, as you know, in Hilchos Tshuva, Pedic Hey and Vav. And he starts with the Pedic with the words Hayacheles v'Rishus nitna l'chaladim. I think. Laseis or l'daber v'lach. To act, to speak, and to think. Even if it's contrary to the desire in his heart, and it's the exact opposite of what the heart wants, but it's realistic for a person behaviorally not to reflect what he feels in his heart. He feels whatever he feels, and he does what the Eibishter says. So the Rebbe says this is called midas habenyani. It's a behavioral self-control, and this is b'cheles v'bchira, the cheles and the shus of each person.
You just define the difference between machshava and feel. Like when I feel something or when I think something.
Feel is a push of a heart. A thought is a focus. I cannot change how I feel. I can change my focus. I'm thinking about this lock, I can think about that lock. If I hate what's behind that door and I look at that lock, I still hate behind that door, but I'm not looking at it. So the emotion to change is not so simple. But the direction of the conscious thought is it's not easy, but it's much easier. Okay? And even at the time, at the moment that the heart desires and lusts, is a taiva gashmi, some material desire, whether it's beheter be isra chas v'shalom, if it's a permitted taiva, which is also not considered good in the world of the Tanya, and certainly if it's a prohibited inyan, God forbid, says the Rebbe yochel his gabi, you can be stronger than the feeling. Not everything you feel you have to give into. To distract your knowledge, your mind from it completely, and just not act on it. We're not saying don't feel, we're not saying don't act on those feelings. And now you have very, very famous words. These are really very famous words. A person can tell himself or herself, my Yetzirah slept me in this direction. You have later in Tanya the expression, Kitan my Yetzirah is fire like a baker's oven. But I don't have to act. I could say no. Why? Because I don't want to be a Rasha. I feel a even for any moment. Why? I refuse to allow myself to become separated and cut off from the Eibishter, b'shum eif in any way, even if it's only for an instant. K'diksiv, as the Pasuk says, Avenesechem avdilim v'gemer, Avenes are a wall. Now, you see, when you say the words Avenesechem avdilim, there's different taichin to Avenesechem avdilim. But the Alter Rebbe takes Aveda Masiach, I'm dealing with Pashtus. The minute that I'm doing the Aveda, I'm not involved with the Eibishter. He's not talking about the Pagam Benefesh. He's talking about that instant. The second that I'm doing the Aveda, that second, I'm cut off from the Eibishter. I don't want that. Rakani Roitze Lidovkabe. I wish to keep attached Nafshi, Ruchi, V'nishmasi, my Nefesh, Ruch, and Neshama. Be his slapshon as they express themselves, as they reveal themselves, as they join themselves. Bishlei shalavu shaviyas barach, and the three supernal garments, the Eibishter's garments, shehem, which are ma'isa action, deeper speech, machshava thought by the Shem v'teirasli u'mitzvah. In Hashem and his Teira and his mitzvahs, l'chol ha'pochos me'ahava mesuteres shebelibi, from the hidden love which is in my heart, lahavaya to the Eibishter, which will be discussed at length in Perikut Ches and Perikut Tes. The Alter Rebbe mentions it here, Bekitzer, K'mei B'leiv Klal Yisrael, as is the case in the heart of the collective Jew. Shenikru Oyav Ishmech, all Jews are called lovers of Hashem's name, even Kalsha Bakalim, because of the Neshama. I want to use the power of my subliminal Neshama to say, I don't want to be a Rasha for a moment, I don't want to be separate from the Eibishter even for an instant. Vafilu Kalsha Bakalim, even the most light-headed Yid, Yochel Limsa Nafsh Akdusha, so Hashem is in a position to sacrifice his soul for the holiness of God. And this person, this Midas Habenini fellow, says to himself, I'm certainly no worse than a Kal Shabakab. And if I wished, I could control myself, and I wish I'm going to control myself. When it comes to the Kal Shabakalim, when it comes to the sinner, it's a ruach shtus. It's a spirit of folly. All of these points we're going to revisit the mitzvah. V'nidmelei and emduchtzach, he thinks sheba aveda zu, that even though he does this aveda, oidena b'yadusei, he's still a good Jew. V'ein nishmasei muvdal, his soul does not become separated. Melekei Yisrael, from the God of Israel during these moments. And I don't want to forget the Lekei Yisrael even for this moment. V'gam, this includes also in order to do the Aveda for that moment, he has to forget the Ava Miseteres, and I don't wish to do it. So it's like several points, right? The first one is Ein Yeretz Eliyas Rosh. The second one is Ein Yeretz Eliyas Nivdal. I don't know, be separate. And the third one is Sheikheach Avosei Lavayam Steres, which is called basically Ruach Shtus. Says this man, Ani Eini Reitz Eliyas Sheite Kameyo Lichbar Ebed. I do not want to be a fool. I came to deny the truth. And with this tool, with this hisbonenus, I don't want to be a Rasha for a moment. I don't want to be caught up from the Eibishter for a moment. I don't want to forget about the Eibishter for a moment, which is covering over the Ava Miseteres. So you can be a Beinani in a minute-by-minute basis, which is called Midas HaBeinani. Now, I want you to understand, the Mitzvah next Sunday, if I'll be here, and I don't have any other plans, we're going to go over this. And I'm going to talk to you about each one of these points that I just pointed out, and I'm going to explain to you the Chiddush Shebedavar. In other words, how, in some cases at least, they're different when these same ideas are discussed in other places in Chassidus, and you'll see the subtlety, the nuance. But the basic, today we're learning Poshet Pshat, right? Mitzvah next Sunday, we'll start over, and we'll focus on the different points, and I'll, with Hashem's help, of course, try to extract a little bit more of what the Rebbe is meaning to say. But the Pashtus, the Rebbe says, a Beinani is, I'm not doing an Aveda. Now, a Beinani that never did an Aveda, never will do an Aveda, is a very high Madrega. But B'chaleis, this hour, I shouldn't do an Aveda, it's absolutely possible. And I'm going to finish with a story which I've told you before, and I heard it from the Baal HaMaaseh. I'll tell you the story. It's a sweet story. It's not a deep story, it's a sweet story. There's a shliach in Florida, his name is Rabbi Yossi Denberg. He told the story in public, so I can say his name. His father's on Gesundsein is Leib Denberg. He's not a young man, Leib Denberg. He's probably closer to 100 than to 90, I'm imagining. He's not a younger man. And he's of Nissen's nephew. His mother, right, she was Mrs. Lieberman's, Sarah Lieberman's grandmother. Her name was Iteheni, I believe. She was of Nissen's Ashvester. My Shver, who was a man of very few words that he's given about das. My Shver didn't say things unless they were true. She was given about das. She was alone for her whole life. Her husband died, I guess, in Shayadem, but he died from starvation in Samarkand in 1943. She lived here for many, many, many years. She never remarried. She was Nissen's sister. her son, this heißt Lebe Denberg, had a very, very strange life trajectory. His father told him to leave the house. His father told him to leave the house because mir geht verschicken. I'm going to be sent to Siberia. I don't want you to get in trouble. So he ended up being raised by an uncle who wasn't frum. That he said to his kids, one of his kids asked him, Hakafas hast dich kaputt? He said, me fragen, was ich like film. He said, why don't I have a beard? Why don't you ask me why I put on film? His whole life is Rabbi Nissen. He's very close to Rabbi Nissen. And Rabbi Nissen was very stark makar of him. Sehr stark makar. And this was his uncle. The Bashas, alive lechafetet. It was his sister's son. And they had a very deep relationship. When Rabbi Nissen visited in Montreal, he stayed in their home. They didn't have a very big home, at least not in those days. So Rabbi Nissen slept with one of the boys. They had 3 sons, I think, or 4 sons. And they took turns. Sleeping with Rabbi Nissen was a big schus. I mean, it wasn't a disturbance because the guy was never in the bedroom anyway. He went to sleep after you, woke up before you. I made a visit. Rabbi Nissen had a stark geschlafen. But they got to hang out with him. So Yossi Denberg tells a story that Nissen was his roommate. And he was going to sleep, and Reb Nissen was in the bedroom. So he said to Reb Nissen that people tell me that you're a Beinani. Is it true that you're a Beinani? What's Reb Nissen supposed to say? Yeah, no, maybe so. A 12-year-old, a boy. He was before a mitzvah. I don't know how old he was a kid. But an American kid, not a kid from Russia, you know. I don't mean American as opposed to Canadian. I mean after the Holocaust as opposed to before the Holocaust. It's a whole other world. And he asked her, are you a Beinani? So Reb Nissen didn't answer him. Reb Nissen asked him, Zog me, what's trachst? He had a whole conversation with this little boy. He says, for 60 seconds, could you control what you think? He says, yeah. So Nissen asks him, how are you going to control what you think? And he gave him a practical answer. I forgot what it was, but he gave him a practical answer. He'll scream the whole 60 seconds. He'll find a way not to let his mind wander. He says, for 60 seconds, can you control what you say? He says, yeah. He says, how? I won't say anything. For 60 seconds, can you control what you'll do? He says, yeah, how? Ich will sitzen auf the hand. He says, I'll sit on my hands. I won't do anything wrong. So Nissen said, try it. So he did it. He says, you see, you were just a Beinani for 60 seconds. He taught him. You were just... Now, Yossi Denberg is a big shliach, a very successful man. So he said at a Fabrenga, I was at a Kiddush, one of his children was getting married. So he said, he practiced this 1 minute a day. He does it to this day. What Reb Nissen told him as a child, 1 minute every day, he's a Beinani. He says, now he made it to 2 minutes. He stops what he's doing. In other words, the hashpah that Reb Nissen had on him was so lasting. To this day, he stops his life for 60 seconds, and he's a Beinani. This is what the Alter Rebbe is teaching. Midas ha-Beinani and Midas Kaladim has nothing to do with what came and what's going to come. It's with now. And Alter Rebbe says, it's Midas Kaladim b'achareh kol odom yibshach. It's a realistic thing, says the Alter Rebbe, for a person to break his life down into small increments, into small sections, subsets of time. And in each unit, you could say it's possible for a person to be a Beinani. And the Alter Rebbe says the avoid, of course, is to make that as many minutes as possible and as many contiguous minutes as possible. But we're not talking here about madreges. This is the word. We're not talking about madreges. Madreges has to do with the muhus of the person. Like I said to you before, what a person is. Midas is not talking about what a person is. Midas is simply discussing what a person is doing. Madregas ha-Beinani, what a person is a high level. But what a person does is a very, very realistic level. The Rebbe says we have to, everybody has to aspire to look at the next 60 seconds. I'm going to do the Ratzon Elyon. From a Mendel. I think I heard it from him. I really think I heard it from him, but it's so many years ago. As Chanduchten, the Mendel Futterfass had an incredible life. He was an incredible human being. And he had stories. His stories were... And he could tell a story like nobody I ever heard. He could tell a story a whole night and you sat with your mouth open. In fact, Oitzi in the neshama until he finished the story. He knew how to keep a crowd, let me tell you. So one of his stories was that he was in Siberia. I don't know when he was Fashik, there was a different time. And he was standing outside a whole night. And he knew that Baderach HaTava, he's going to freeze to death. There's just no way. In the morning, he'll still be up. It's too cold. So he asked himself, and I've never heard this, Baruch Hashem, I don't know this experience. The worst part about freezing to death is you just fall asleep. It's very peaceful. You fall asleep and then you don't wake up. The only way to keep yourself awake is to concentrate. To use your brain, not to let your body fall asleep. How can a person that's so cold and all your body wants to do is relax? I've heard descriptions of Chassidim walking in the wintry nights, and a guy sits down, and Michal Teitelbaum walks up to him and says, "Stell dich weg!" He says, "Ich will liegen 5 Minuten." Michal says, "Nicht kein 1 Sekunde. You lay 1 minute, you're not getting up." And the guy was so tired. He saved his life. So the Mendel described it again. I think I heard it from him. That the Mendel asked himself, "Can I pay attention for 5 minutes?" 5 minutes is 300 seconds. It's a lot of time. It's a lot of time. A second is longer than you think. He says, "Yeah." Hat abgezählt 300 seconds. He counted consciously. And when the 5 minutes was over, he said to himself, "Mendel, can you do 5 more minutes?" He kept himself alive. I heard the story from him. He was in the Shom of a Guf. I didn't have a gili from Gan Eden. A whole night. But Mendel was not that Bashtarid. I mean, Mendel described how he learned in Tfisa. He didn't have any Svarim. You know, people don't know this. The Mendel was a Balnigle. The Mendel was a Balnigle. The Mendel was a Balnigle Lenin. Like the Loshen is Junger Eit hat genutzt the größte Birche, der Rocht hat weggelegt the größte Birche und genommen the kleine Birche lach. That's how Chassidim expressed it. But they can't learn it. So they asked the Mendel, "How did you learn?" He says, he had plenty of time, free time. They had on Ashir in Sibir. And he was in the Cheder, and he listened to his Malamed say, and he brought back his childhood Torah, and he made himself recall it from the subconscious to his consciousness, and that's how we learn Torah. It's a koyach, it's a special koyach, and has to do with unbelievable rots. So, but you're breaking down your life into intervals, into small little subsections. A person could be a balabayis over himself for a minute. This is the message of this Perek. Mr. Next week, we're going to go over it again. I'm going to talk about each point. Eineni liyas Rasha, afil shah achas. Eineni reitz liyas nifed many yizbarach, afil shah achas. And eineni reitz liyas sheitas kamei. Later on, you have words lichbeit as emes. Oh, we read them already. Eineni reitz liyas sheitas kamei lichbeit as emes. I don't want to deny the truth that if I do an aveda for those seconds, I'm doing the aveda. I'm nifed many yizbarach. Okay, so we'll take a break and we'll do a Yom Mitzvah.